Have you ever wondered about the history of the fork? Or how something as simple and ordinary as a fork actually came about? You use one every single day without a second thought. But this humble piece of metal with a few prongs is actually the most resisted utensil in human history. It got a woman branded as vain, offended the church, threatened ideas of masculinity, and spent over 1,000 years fighting to conquer the dinner table. What you're about to hear is one of the strangest journeys any everyday object has ever taken, complete with religious condemnation, royal bans, cultural mockery, and centuries of pure, stubborn human resistance. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll never look at that fork in your kitchen drawer the same way again. Consider this for a moment. The knife has existed for approximately 2.5 million years, and the spoon goes back to roughly 1000 BC. But the table fork, the one designed specifically for eating, came so late to the party that food anthropologist Lucia Galasso described it plainly when she said, "For millennia, man used his fingers to bring food to his mouth. It was probably for this reason that the need for a fork was felt less than that of the spoon and knife. In fact, it was born last, and its use was sporadic before its definitive adoption towards the middle of the 19th century. The middle of the 19th century is not ancient history. It falls within the lifetime of people's great-great-grandparents, which means the fork, as a normal, everyday object used by ordinary people, is genuinely that recent. The word itself traces back to the Latin furca, meaning pitchfork, and that etymology is not accidental, because the fork's origin was a farm tool, something used to move hay and dirt. And that agricultural association tells you everything about how people first received the idea of bringing one to a dinner table. Not elegant, not civilized. A pointy agricultural implement that had no business near a meal. And before we get to how that changed, we have to go back further, because the fork's earliest ancestors were not European at all. The oldest physical forks ever discovered came out of China, with bone forks unearthed at sites connected to the Qijia culture, dated between 2400 and 1900 BC, and additional examples found at Shang Dynasty sites running from around 1600 to 1050 BC. These are real objects, dug up and studied, and their existence proves the concept of the fork stretches back thousands of years before Europe ever touched one. The catch is that these Chinese forks were never used for eating. They handled hot meats over fire, managed food during cooking, and stayed in the kitchen, while chopsticks remained the utensil of the table, a distinction that would repeat itself across multiple civilizations. Ancient Greece followed the same pattern, where large forked tools pulled food from boiling pots, and Poseidon himself carried a trident in mythology as a symbol of power. Yet at the Greek dinner table, people reached for spoons, knife points, and their own hands. Roman kitchens relied on fork-like tools for shellfish and firework, and those tools never made it to the dining room either. What this pattern tells us is that for thousands of years, across China, Greece, and Rome, the fork existed as a tool, but nobody connected the idea of bringing it to the table. And when that idea did surface, it never took hold. The place where it finally stuck was the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman civilization centered in Constantinople, where by the 4th century, forks had moved off the kitchen counter and onto the dining table, making them personal rather than purely functional. And that small cultural step set everything else in motion. The moment most historians point to as the fork's explosive entry into Western Europe happened at a wedding in Venice in the year 1004. A Byzantine noblewoman named Maria Argyropulina, a second cousin of Emperor Basil II, traveled to Venice to marry the son of the Venetian Doge and brought her customs with her, her Byzantine refinement, and her fork. At the wedding feast, while every other guest ate with their fingers as people had always done, Maria produced a golden instrument with 2 prongs and used it to carry food to her mouth, refusing to let her hands touch the meal at all. Venice erupted in response, and a Venetian cleric delivered words that were recorded and passed down across 1,000 years. God in his wisdom has provided man with natural forks, his fingers. Therefore, it is an insult to him to substitute artificial metal forks for them when eating. The fork was not merely rude, it was an insult to God himself, and Maria's refusal to eat with her hands was condemned as arrogance, vanity, and an offense against the divine order by educated and powerful people who were not fringe voices. 2 years later, Maria died in a plague outbreak that also claimed her husband and her son, and Italian clergy treated her death as confirmation of their position, calling it divine punishment for the sin of using a fork. The most famous written condemnation came from Saint Peter Damian, an Italian cardinal who described how she would command her eunuchs to cut her food into small pieces, which she would impale on a certain golden instrument with 2 prongs and thus carry to her mouth, labeling it excessive delicacy and connecting the plague directly to her vanity. The critical detail, though, is that Peter Damian wrote this approximately 50 years after Maria's death, which means he witnessed none of it. And what that gap reveals is how culturally powerful the moment remained, still circulating as a warning, still generating outrage, half a century after a woman used a fork at her own wedding. Despite the scandal, or possibly energized by it, the fork began a slow climb through Italian culture over the following centuries, gaining visibility in the Italian peninsula by the 11th century and reaching cookbooks by the 13th. A cookbook presented to Robert of Anjou, the King of Naples, included instructions telling his dinner guests to use a pronged instrument when picking up slippery sheets of lasagna, because pasta proved too difficult to handle with fingers alone. B. Wilson, who wrote one of the definitive books on the history of kitchen tools, captured the logic precisely. Pasta and the fork seem made for one another. Having discovered how useful forks were for eating noodles, Italians started to use them for the rest of the meal too. Pasta gave the fork a purpose that fingers genuinely could not replicate as efficiently, and once Italians adopted it for noodles, extending that logic to the rest of the meal required almost no convincing. Commonplace in Italy by the 14th century, and nearly universal among the merchant and upper classes by 1600, the fork had fully solved its image problem on the Italian peninsula, while the rest of Europe remained either unaware or unconvinced. A fascinating social ritual emerged from this adoption, where proper etiquette required dinner guests to arrive carrying their own fork and spoon in a personal case called a cadena, because assuming your host would provide one was considered presumptuous. The fork had shifted from communal kitchen tool to personal possession, something you owned, maintained, and carried with you. And that transition from shared instrument to individual property marks one of the more telling moments in the whole story. One of the most famous fork stories in history also happens to be one of the most debated, and it centers on a wedding in Marseille on October 28, 1533, when Catherine de' Medici, an Italian noblewoman from one of Florence's most powerful families, married the future King Henry II of France. Popular history credits Catherine with bringing a collection of silver forks from Italy to the French court, where her lavish banquets and insistence on refined table manners transformed the fork from a curiosity into a symbol of elegance and social distinction among the French aristocracy. Food anthropologist Lucia Galasso describes Catherine's influence this way. Her emphasis on refined manners made the fork a definitive symbol of elegance and social distinction at the French court. The complication is that the earliest known written reference specifically connecting Catherine to bringing forks to France comes from the Encyclopédie, published in 1754, which puts it more than 200 years after the marriage took place. And that gap makes it impossible to confirm that she personally packed forks as a deliberate cultural import in 1533. What historians broadly accept is that Catherine de' Medici reshaped French dining culture, that her court raised Italian culinary standards in France, and that fork use spread through the French aristocracy during her time there. So the effect was real, even if the specific detail of her carrying forks in her luggage is likely embellished. The Catherine de' Medici fork story is best understood as true in spirit, possibly sharpened in the retelling, and worth knowing as the legend it has become. While Italy and France were gradually coming around, England wanted nothing to do with the fork, and the story of how it finally arrived there is one of the more entertaining chapters in this entire history. A British traveler named Thomas Coryate passed through Italy in 1608, observed locals eating with forks, found himself genuinely impressed, adopted the practice on the spot, brought the concept back to England, and published his account in 1611 in a book called Coryat's Crudities. England's response was to laugh at him. The English called forks unnecessary and effeminate, dismissed them as a ridiculous continental affectation, and gave Coryate a nickname that captured their feelings: Furcifer, a Latin word meaning fork-bearer that doubled as a term for rascal or scoundrel. The resistance ran deeper than mockery, though. Among men particularly, a genuine cultural conviction held that using a fork was unmanly, that it created an artificial distance from eating, which food historian Ken Albala described as the fork signaling distance from what was considered a basic animal act: eating. Picking food up with your hands was raw, direct, and honest, while using a fork was performing something, pretending toward a refinement that felt dishonest to the act itself. Religious leaders added a different objection, pointing to the fork's physical resemblance to the devil's pitchfork, the tines, the shape, the association with hellfire, and in a deeply religious society, that comparison carried genuine weight. Queen Elizabeth I, reigning from 1558 to 1603, had access to forks throughout her time on the throne and chose not to use them, finding the act of spearing food crude and preferring to eat with her fingers, which means one of the most powerful monarchs in European history looked at a fork and decided her hands were better. Running parallel to the cultural resistance against the fork was a separate development that would eventually make the fork not just desirable, but necessary. For most of human history, dinner knives were sharp, obviously and practically sharp, and diners used their pointed tips to stab food and carry it to their mouths, which was entirely normal practice at tables across Europe. Around 1637, Cardinal Richelieu, who served as chief minister to King Louis XIII of France, grew tired of watching guests pick their teeth with knife points at the dinner table and began pushing for blunt-tipped table knives, reportedly finding the habit both irritating and vaguely threatening. Then, in 1669, Louis XIV, Louis XIII's son and a different king entirely, went further and issued a formal ban on all pointed knives, ending the era of the sharp dinner knife as a dining tool. The connection to the fork is direct. Once a knife can no longer function as a stabbing implement for getting food into your mouth, something else has to take its place, and the fork was positioned perfectly to fill that gap. By 1700, most Europeans had widely adopted forks as standard dining tools, and a French etiquette manual from 1782 listed forks not as optional luxuries, but as requirements of civilized dining, confirming that the argument was over in Europe. The blunting of the knife didn't just change how people cut their food, it created a practical void that the fork stepped into. And that functional need accomplished what centuries of cultural advocacy had failed to do. Laying all of this out from beginning to end reveals something that goes well beyond cutlery history. The fork's spread was not driven by obvious utility, because if practical value alone determined adoption, the table fork would have conquered Europe within a few generations of the Byzantines embracing it. What slowed it down for centuries was identity. Ken Albala captured this directly when he described the fork as signaling distance from what was considered a basic animal act: eating. Every objection anyone raised against the fork, from the Venetian clergy to the English aristocracy to American colonists, connected back to that same anxiety about what using one said about a person. Eating with your hands was natural and honest and connected to something real. Using a fork was performance, artifice, a way of pretending to be something different from what you were. Change is always the hardest thing to sell, and the fork was selling change every single time someone picked it up. The woman who brought it to Venice died of plague and had her death declared punishment by the clergy. The man who promoted it in England was publicly called a scoundrel. American colonists refused it for generations. A queen of England looked at one and chose her fingers. And yet, here we are. Every single day, billions of people around the world reach for a four-tined, curved, stainless steel utensil without hesitation and use it to eat their meals. Because the fork won. It just needed 1,000 years, a few kings, a blunted knife policy, the unstoppable logic of pasta, and a metallurgist in Sheffield who was looking for something else entirely to finally get there. That fork in your kitchen drawer carries a longer, stranger, and more contested history than almost anything else you will touch today. That's the origin point. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe to Origin Point for more surprising stories behind the ordinary things we use every day. And tell me in the comments, what everyday object should we uncover the origin of next? The spoon? The toothbrush? The zipper? The button? I'll read every comment. See you in the next one.